The information and opinions presented in this Arc Energy Ideas podcast are provided for informational purposes only and are subject to the disclaimer link in the show notes.
This is the Arc Energy Ideas podcast with Peter Tertzakian and Jackie Forrest, exploring trends that influence the energy business.
Welcome to the Arc Energy Ideas podcast. I'm Jackie Forrest.
And I'm Peter Tertzakian. Welcome back. Well, it was a beautiful weekend here in Calgary.
Like summer heat.
It really was. Yeah. It really was. And over the weekend, there was a different kind of a heat in different kind of rooms, I would say, with the OPEC meetings over on the other side of the pond, where they're talking about production cuts, and they did agree to cut, or at least Saudi Arabia did.
Yeah, that's right. So Saudi Arabia announced a 1 million barrel a day cut. This is potentially doubling the cut for the entire group relative to October of 2022. Mm-hmm. What's different about this one is Saudi Arabia is making all of the cut. The rest of the 23 different countries involved are making no cuts, although they are committing to keep with the cuts they already had.
Right.
So this is a little bit different of a strategy. Before, Saudi wanted all the others to also take some pain
Proportionally.
And it wasn't always the case because of a lot of reasons in terms of where the quotas were and things like that. But this time, Saudi's saying, hey, we're willing to take the hit here, and we want to stabilize oil price, which had fallen below $70 last week. It's now at $72 as of this morning as we're recording.
Right. All of this lowering of output is a consequence of weakness in the broader oil market as a consequence, or an expectation of weakness in largely the Chinese market, right?
Well, it's interesting. It's kind of a weird market. If you look at any analyst, it shows a very tight market in the second half of the year, like, maybe draws of 2 million barrels a day coming out of inventory because we don't have enough crude oil to meet demand. So that would imply $80 plus type market, especially when you consider where inventories are, which are kind of at average levels. But we're not there, right? We had $68 oil last week, and that's because people are concerned about a recession. And those outlooks for the big draws in the tight market require about 2 million barrels a day of oil demand growth this year. And people are concerned whether it be China or just broadly, the interest rate hikes that are slowing down the economy, that we're not going to see that. So it's a strange market that way. And Saudi's saying, they're saying, hey, I believe in the underinvestment. I think the market's going to tighten at some point. I'm willing to take a hit here in the meantime just to get prices high, because I think they know that their supply will be needed at some point.
Right. That is the overarching narrative, is that demand is going to level out here depending upon global economic activity, and that underinvestment and supply will be insufficient to even meet that demand. That's the expectation as we roll into the second half, which is only 3.5 weeks away. So is summer driving season. We're revving up for that, if you pardon the pun. So it's interesting that they felt they had to cut now. I guess it's really to shore up the price above $70. Is that the...
I think so. And they kept saying that we really value market stability, which means probably prices being in a range that works for them.
Well, we're going to be talking about this more, because as we roll into second half, that's when all the expectations of tightening market and higher prices. So we'll follow it. See?
Definitely. But today we want to talk more about electricity and all the changes that are coming to the electricity markets, whether it be from growing demand. We know the EVs are coming and this push to electrify everything. We know wind and solar generation is growing fast. And although it's still a small amount of generation in many places today, it's expected to grow. And it brings with it a lot of volatility in terms of how it comes on and how unpredictable it is. And then the third thing that's coming is artificial intelligence. And, no matter where you look, there's discussion of how AI is going to change industries, whether it be writing scripts for movies or writing songs. But we haven't talked on the podcast about how it's going to affect energy, and it will have an impact, we think, on electrical markets.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, AI, we're going to talk about how it is going to be used to predict supply and demand. But importantly, AI has to be powered by electricity. And we know that data centers are expanding, and we're going to talk about that, which means more electricity demand against the backdrop of changing supply structure, the shift from base load to more intermittent renewable. Anyway, I'm already talking too much, and we have had electricity experts on our program podcast before, but we have never had somebody who is in the trenches of actually trading the electricity. So on that note, welcome Cory Paddock, who's president and co-founder of GBE Energy, an electricity and energy trading house here in Calgary. Welcome, Cory.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, maybe first, Cory, just tell us a little bit about yourself and about GBE Energy.
Great. Yeah. So Cory Paddock, born and raised Calgarian. My dad was actually born here too. Very much a part of all the institutions that exist here in the city. Went to University of Calgary, have a couple of degrees from U of C, played volleyball at U of C. And after I graduated, I was really interested in finding a career to match the competitive aspects of sport and analytical skill. And, trading is a very interesting place to express that. Every day you're either winning or losing. You know whether you're getting better or worse. You get immediate feedback.
Right, in your wallet.
In your wallet,
right.
The numbers do not lie, yeah. So I learned the business here in Calgary, actually, at TransAlta. And this is going back into the late 2000s, I guess. Was lucky enough to work my way up from kind of the back office there onto the trade floor. And actually, TransAlta has produced a number of really, really high-class traders in the power markets over the years, many of which have gone on to found their own firms as well. So quite a significant institution when you think about power markets here in Calgary.
Yeah. When I tell people about electricity trading and what goes on behind the scenes when they flip on the light switch, it's a little bit hard for sort of the average citizen to think about electricity trading because it's a commodity that is somewhat nebulous. I can touch a barrel of oil if I really wanted to as a trading. I can visualize a barrel of oil, but electricity is really nebulous. Can you give us a sense of exactly what's being traded?
Sure, yeah. So the way to think about this is to start at how do you actually arrive at an electricity price? Mm-hmm. So there's really three big aspects to conceptualize this. One is the actual generation side. So you've got renewables, obviously, wind and solar. And then on the kind of dispatchable side or fuel side, you've got nuclear, you've got coal, you've got gas. And all these different energy sources have different characteristics about them. So meaning, how long they need to run in order to be economic, the ramp rates, so how quickly they can ramp up and down. So that's a major consideration just on the supply side. And then on the demand side, the demand is very variable. So you've got, a certain amount of base load that you can quantify and think about like temporally over the span of years. So there's obviously like day of the week, there's hour of the day, and then there's seasonality to a lot of these things as well.
So base load, just to be clear for our audience, is just sort of like that background base level of electricity you need to keep society running, including factories that run 24/7. Our collective refrigerators and furnaces, well, not furnaces,
like
typically gas.
All kinds of loads that roll up into something predictable.
Predictable, right. And then there's the sort of the morning rush and the evening rush.
Yeah, even a lot of that is very, very predictable, depending on the time of year, the time of day, when the sun's rising and setting, et cetera. And then where things get more volatile is just weather. So at a high level, in the winter, how much electricity people are using for heating. They're tending to stay inside more often.
Right.
And then you get into summer, and then you're talking about air conditioning loads.
So in conceptualizing this, the units of electricity that flow off the wires, like if we consider the wires the assembly line, the conveyor belt coming into the house, that every hour we have a kilowatt or kilowatts of electricity flowing in, and that you are able to source it from different sources and pair it to the demand, and that's what you're trading.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it's probably worth discussing too, just like how different markets can be throughout North America. So this is going back to kind of the early 2000s, late 90s. There was a big effort to deregulate electricity markets, and a number of jurisdictions did that, including Alberta. So Alberta was an early adopter when it comes to that.
So it's just like a market that you would go to trade anything from vegetables to whatever, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, it's electricity.
Yeah, exactly. We didn't discuss this part about electricity in that, of course, it's talked about quite often that you can't store it. So by virtue of that, this is a very, very dynamic process. And in all the deregulated markets of North America, you've got a price basically every 5 minutes. And then it can even get more granular than that when you're talking about most of the grids in the United States that are deregulated have nodal prices or locational marginal prices, where you're trying to calculate, or not trying, you do calculate the price at several nodes within the system. And when I say several, I'm not talking like one or two, I'm talking several thousand.
Right. A lot of places that are regulated, also the regulated price comes into the homes of our listeners, and they pay a constant price. But behind the scenes, there is all this kilowatt hour trading going on.
Yep.
And it's also probably worth talking about the major areas of North America's power grid.
Sure. Yeah. So, and this is kind of an interesting history in that, if you were starting from scratch right now, you'd map everything out quite differently. But like everything, these things started off as simple systems, then worked their way up to complex systems. So all the grids in North America do operate at 60 hertz. So that's the frequency of the grid and the frequency that all of our, major machines work at, all of the devices that we have in our homes. However, they're not all synchronized. So there's a Western grid, there's an Eastern grid, there's a Quebec grid, and there's a Texas grid, meaning all these 4 grids are operating at 60 hertz, but they're not synchronized with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So Alberta resides in the Western grid, and Saskatchewan resides in the Eastern grid. So you've got a situation here where actually Saskatoon is electrically connected to Miami, and Fort McMurray or Edmonton is electrically connected to San Diego, but Calgary and Regina are not electrically connected.
So this also creates some of these cross-provincial issues.
Yes.
When we try to think about synchronization and the broader discussion, which we won't get into, of achieving net zero, et cetera, by electrifying the country.
Right.
Because the grid has evolved over North America in such a way that it's challenging to politically synchronize, let alone physically synchronize.
Well, you can connect them, though, with different types of connections, right, where they're not connected in a way that...
Yeah, so you can connect them with DC ties, direct current ties, which is essentially like you can conceptually think about it like you can connect a power plant from Saskatchewan sending power into Alberta.
Sure.
But those flows can only go in one direction at one given time.
Well, we don't need to get deep into the physics other than to say that this conversation illustrates the complexity of trying to electrify everything in the pursuit of net zero. But let's talk about now what also happens with this complexity when you start to radically change the composition of the supply, which is happening with the introduction of renewables, which, as you said earlier, there's all sorts of different types of supply of electrical energy. Some are more intermittent than others, et cetera, et cetera. So now you have to start thinking about how each supplier comes into the market.
Yep. We could talk about PJM, which is the biggest deregulated market in the world.
That's Pennsylvania, Jersey,
Maryland. Yeah, so this is an area that runs from New Jersey down through into Virginia, includes Ohio, and then also includes Metro Chicago. So lots of different politics, lots of different fuel sources. And this is an area that has basically all the fuel sources that we think about in modern times. So there's a lot of nuclear power. There's still a lot of coal power. There's gas generation. It's sitting on the Marcellus. There's a lot of wind generation, and then we're adding a lot of solar as well.
Right.
So, even since my career started, I've seen the grid evolve quite a bit.
Right.
Where we've seen a lot of coal to gas switching, which changed the market quite a bit. In that the entire transmission system was set up to deliver coal energy eastward to where demand is. And then all of a sudden, gas generation shows up and starts to beat coal. And then all the flows and all the lines start to move in different ways that were originally designed. So you started to see different congestion in the grid that didn't exist previously.
Right. So this is that kind of broad market and deep market, I'll call it, because of the population base there, is sort of an indicator of what potentially can happen to other markets, such as our own. And just as a side note, I find it intriguing that GBE Energy, which you co-founded, trades actively in those markets. So when somebody flips a switch on in Maryland, basically you have bought and sold it to them.
Yep. This is true. Yeah.
Deregulated markets can become efficient.
Out of Calgary. Well, that's, it's amazing.
Well, let's talk about how much is the percentage of renewables generation in that market. Like in Alberta, I think we're at 12% of generation. Texas, I think, is already near 30%. And have you seen any issues come from the greater amount of solar and wind coming on that is a little bit less predictable than those baseload generations?
I don't think necessarily issues. I mean, it's very different. And the operators, they adapt to this new situation. But these things also happen kind of gradually, and then suddenly you look back and it's like, oh, wow, that was actually a pretty significant amount of the electricity generated last year. So, I think when it comes to renewables, there's one thing to consider as well in that renewables are really not able to be what they are currently without modern computing. We don't necessarily make those two associations immediately. And that has to do with a couple things. One, we're getting quite good at figuring out where to source these things based on historical weather data and historical cloud cover data,
When you
et
mean
cetera.
source, you mean place them.
Place them, exactly.
Yeah.
Where do we have high solar capacity capability? Where do we have high wind capacity capabilities? And then, weather forecasting has improved significantly. So we're still pretty lousy at 3 to 4 weeks out. We know roughly what's going to happen seasonally. But I would say like 7 days out, we're getting pretty good. So operators are already looking, a week out and making their forecasts and making dispatch decisions around, how the composition is going to work into the real time.
Right. So as a trader, you're looking for potential volatility in those predictions between buyers and sellers.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Now, some people have said that as we get more and more renewables on, even if you can predict it better, it's going to create issues because some of those baseload generators are going to maybe not make as much money, not be needed as much of the day as they were before, or maybe these peak generators, although they might get high prices when they're needed, they're used less and less. So people have said we're going to have to move these free markets to some sort of hybrid. For example, Texas is now moving towards capacity payments, I understand, to create more incentive for those base loads so they get paid just for being there, even if they're not generating. Do you think we need changes in the market design as we see more and more renewables to ensure that that reliability is there, that those base load generators that aren't used as much are still available?
I don't think we know exactly how we should be structuring these markets. If you're thinking about like long time horizons, we're still kind of trying to figure things out as we go along here. So I think a lot of the debate around capacity markets has to do with acute events that have never happened before. And the problem with acute events that have never happened before is, well, how do we forecast when those events are actually going to happen again?
Like weather, basically.
Like weather,
like an ice storm in Texas.
So I think, roughly speaking, we know generally when wind and solar are going to be around, at a seasonal level. But after that, it becomes a little bit more difficult to forecast out where this is going to kind of land, right? So I think there's a few jurisdictions that are worth watching for the next several years.
Yeah.
One is California, because there's, a really, really high penetration of solar. We're seeing duck curves start to show up. This is becoming more of a common term now in the energy landscape.
So duck curve is the curve of the surge of electricity demand in the morning. Then it's kind of levels out, and then surge when people come home in the evening and turn on their stove to cook and stuff like that.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is completely different demand curves than we've previously seen for kind of the same weather and same time of year.
Why is that?
What you're seeing is, let's just use the example of solar. So solar at its limit, right, is peaking in the middle of the day at the same time that air conditioning used to peak. But all of a sudden, air conditioning and solar are this amazing offset. So it turns out to be, no load. And back to what your original point was, you're seeing a little peak in the morning, followed by a trough in the middle of the day, followed by another peak in the evening when solar is coming off, but air conditioning is still hanging around because it's still pretty warm and your buildings are warm. So the previous curve was kind of a gradual ramping up of fossil generation, let's call it, and nuclear, et cetera, to meet that load. And then, it was quite a predictable thing. And now what you're seeing is this trough in the middle of the day that is also associated with, really, really low prices. And then, a peak in the evening with quite high prices. And just to give you an idea of like the scale, you could see a situation where in a matter of 2 or 3 hours, you need to ramp up 20,000 megawatts or 30,000 megawatts, kind of at the limit. It might even be bigger than that.
Just in California, just in one
California,
state.
just in one state. Yeah.
So it's the swing consumption profile that is causing issues, and whether or not the supply can respond to that.
Yep.
And is it expected that the mismatch or potential mismatch between what we can supply to meet these swings in demand, is that potential? Some people say, oh my God, this is going to be a huge problem. Others say, no, we can smooth it out. So where are you? What are you seeing in the trading pit?
It very much depends on the jurisdiction, I think. So in the example of California, conceptually, we've been talking about renewables and storage together for a while. And it's one thing to conceptually talk about it. It's another thing to actually see some really low prices and see a price signal for storage to actually show up and get a return.
Right.
So now if you're seeing like all these days and years of, very, very low prices in the middle of the day and an arbitrage, well, storage looks a lot more attractive.
Right. If you're getting very low price,
so-
you want to sell into that, higher
the
price.
cure for low prices is low prices.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's pick up on that because, this notion is so important of price signals. Again, I sort of equate it to a market or an auction or whatever.
Yep.
You go and there's a seller that basically says, I'm not going to sell to you. You're not offering me enough.
Yep.
But as soon as the price goes up, the seller then at some point says, okay, fine, I'll sell to you.
Yep.
Right.
Only if they were able to store those electrons,
and in this case, so on the storage note, I want to go back to your comment a couple minutes ago. You said we don't know whether or not the supply side, because it's just evolving, can meet this. One of the big wild cards, of course, is storage and home storage and electric vehicles as a potential storage, such as the Ford. What is it? The
F-150,
the Lightning.
And other cars, I think
And other-
California is actually mandating that all cars need to be bidirectional by a certain time.
Right. So basically, your car becomes a battery,
Yep.
and we'll see how that grows. I mean, how are you thinking about all that stuff as you?
It's becoming real. Yeah, it's becoming real. And I think again, it's important to think about what jurisdiction you're in and where this can actually apply. In Alberta, in the dead of winter, that is going to be very, very challenging and not going to work.
Right.
But if you're in the Sun Belt and you've got quite reliable solar output, the economics, I think, are going to look more and more attractive over time to shave off these peaks from your home usage, depending on the extent time of use pricing actually makes its way to the retail customer.
Right. I think we should switch to talking about AI.
AI.
Yeah. So one thing we haven't talked about is one way to deal with all of these changes, whether it be the growing demand from EVs or the more volatile type of supply that's a bit harder to predict when it's coming on, is to use AI. Peter and I are already using AI in our research for energy, and it's already making a difference.
How do you know this is really me here? You don't.
That's right. We trained AI to sound like Peter, and it's amazing. Now, that's why he's able to do 26 hours a day, not like the rest of us. But ChatGPT is good. I have to say, though, I don't think it's totally going to replace me. So I still have some job security. I've been testing it.
No, not right now.
It's not always right.
You've heard of this term hallucinating, where it makes up stuff and confidently reports it as an answer to your question. I find the questions that I ask, the algorithm hallucinates a lot. In other words, dishes me a lot of nonsense that you better check. Otherwise, it's wrong.
Yeah. But I mean, it's right sometimes too.
Yeah, it's right.
I've seen some efficiencies. I think it gets 70% of there, maybe half of the way
Well,
there.
it's amazing, the tool
Yeah.
and other things, but check your work when you use it.
Well, so I used ChatGPT to help me with this podcast, and I said to it, make a list of ways AI could change electricity markets for our discussion. And I have to say it did a very good job.
Stuff like that is great.
So let's go through the list, Cory.
Okay.
It talked about energy optimization and efficiency. So it basically said that AI could be used to optimize energy generation, transmission, and consumption. And it didn't give me any examples. That's one of my value add was here. So I was thinking, well, one thing is, shifting demand, that we talk about that a lot, especially for things like EVs that could have a choice to shift the demand. And another thing I thought about is they talk about dynamic rating of transmission lines, that transmission lines could actually carry much more electricity than they do today, but we're being very conservative in terms of how we're rating them. And so those are two areas that could really be big changers.
Is that true?
It is true. One way to think about this is, we've got a lot of steel in the ground currently that is not fully optimized. And building more steel in the ground is getting more and more expensive. And
Or permitting is difficult.
exactly. So I think just the economics of optimizing the existing system will be preferable.
Right. So in the pipeline world, it's like figuring out ways to optimize flow to get an incremental 100,000 barrels a day through the pipe.
Yep.
Yeah. Hey, the Enbridge Mainline, they almost doubled their capacity or the amount they were flowing through these incremental improvements. And I think there's with AI, there may be a lot of opportunity with our power grid. And that's the thing people maybe aren't thinking about.
To put
more electrons through the same infrastructure.
Yeah, so we've got winter line ratings and summer line ratings already, but those measurements can't happen in real time yet. So this is one use case that,
I will put this article in the show notes, actually. I found this interesting article in Vermont. And it's a bit about this shifting of demand. And we talked a little bit about consumers need to get an economic value for doing this. But this company is paying a big part of people's power walls as long as they can control them. And the article says that they're like 1 week they saved a whole bunch of money just because they could use the power wall of the people and that storage allowed them to avoid a bunch of bottlenecks in their system. So I think this is all just starting, but I think AI can enable a whole bunch of decisions to be made over a whole bunch of power walls that one human couldn't have done.
So what you're saying basically is like I have a Tesla Power wall in my house, and that the utility that supplies my electricity can tap into that unbeknownst to me and pull on my battery to power a neighbor who's pulling hard on their electric car.
Exactly, and maybe the neighborhood grid can't be at that level, so they start to use the power walls from the other houses to meet
basically
that load.
Aggregate all the power walls in one giant battery and kind of manage.
But what groups are doing fundamentally is doing the math on, should we do these power walls or should we build new transmission?
Right.
And they're saying, no, this is cheaper, and it gives us more visibility, and we can manage our grid better.
To the extent people want somebody else controlling the electricity in your house.
But if you got it for free, like, this, I actually talked to someone from Vermont, and he has 2 of them, and he's like, it's great because now his solar is there and he's backed up all the time.
Yeah.
And so for him, it was like a no-brainer. They have control of using it when they want, but he gets a lot of benefits too.
Right. Yeah. It's a no-brainer until such time somebody turns into some conspiracy theory. So communication of what is being done is really paramount, in my opinion.
Well, let's go to what the next idea that ChatGPT had, which was
let's hear it.
Renewable energy integration. So basically saying that AI can do a better job of analyzing weather and predicting when we're going to get renewable generation. So, Cory, do you think is that happening already? Is there room to improve that still? What are the benefits?
That has been happening for a decade.
With AI? Or just other systems?
Well, weather prediction is AI in many ways. So.
Yeah. A lot of the work that's been happening in weather forecasting for years has filtered into the energy systems in ways that we don't necessarily talk about, just based on what I was talking about before.
So, like, this morning, you're trading electricity in the Midwest. Are you getting a prediction for Chicago's sun and how much solar generation is going to come because of that? Are people doing that?
Of course.
Yeah.
How accurate is it?
Pretty accurate. Yeah. But this is still, on a day-to-day basis, there's still plenty of anomalies. So if you're thinking about like the capacity factor of a solar farm over a year, we can get pretty good accurate readings. But then once you get into kind of granular hour by hour, then there's obviously differences. But we're getting better at predicting that for sure.
Sure. And what about managing, or I don't know what the word is, reconciling the gut feel of a trader versus the gut feel of an algorithm in this?
Yeah, this is a good question. Yeah. I guess going back to any kind of trading day, you're always fundamentally looking at all the fundamental data that can actually drive price. And sometimes supply wins out, sometimes demand wins out. And you just get this gut feeling around a particular day, and which is the factor that is going to move the needle in one way or another.
And which, in that regard, put your money on the table.
Yep.
Well, this gets me to your job, Cory, because ChatGPT also wants to take your job. It's telling me that it's going to be useful for energy trading and market optimization, support energy market participants in making informed decisions. Well, eventually maybe it could just take over their jobs though, right? So give me some examples of how it might help you with trading. And do you think that there's a future where the algorithms are better than the people?
I have no comment.
You're conflicted in this answer.
We've been thinking about this for quite a while. It's a pretty complex thing to wrap your head around. I think just in general, AI and ML suffers from kind of this bandwidth issue where practitioners and the folks that have all this tacit knowledge don't necessarily have the technical knowledge and back and forth. So it's actually about increasing pipelines between those two pathways in order to get stuff to function better.
Yeah, I think this is the thing is that there's going to be big differences in AI capability in these different regions and sub-regions in the markets. And each region and the traders in each region is going to be using different data sources, which in doing so will create the anomalies and the arbitrages that traders work off of. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say, yeah. But it's clear that it'll help calculate much bigger data sets than than previously possible, and compare data sets that weren't necessarily being looked at together at the same time before.
Yeah.
Increase the efficiency then. Maybe you need less traders and they're more informed than they used to be, potentially, right? Or less people in the back room.
The arc of history for a lot of
I've studied and worked with predicting data using algorithms for most of my career. And the adage, of course, was garbage in, garbage out. So to what extent is the data going into these models cleaned up sufficiently in your mind these days relative to where we were, say, 10 or 15 years ago? Has there been improvement in such that there's less garbage in?
Yeah, I think so. But at the same time, I think you brought up a good point in that AI does a pretty good job of explaining what happened already, but does not do a great job of explaining what's going to happen.
Right. Well, getting back to my comment about how AI hallucinates on qualitative stuff, makes stuff up. Well, it could make stuff up easily numerically, which can have major consequences in your wallet as a trader, right?
It would do poorly in tail events, put it this way.
Tail as in rare, sort of like ice storms and things like that.
Exactly.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about how demand. Everyone knows demand's going up, and it depends on if you think we're going to electrify heating and how many EVs are going to come on. But what about computing power? There's already a whole bunch of server farms being built, and could there even be more because of the use of AI? Could AI actually, you see that with Bitcoin in Texas, how it's added a material amount of demand. Could that be another issue here, is that demand and supply get further apart because of this growing use of AI?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I don't think it's very well intuited just how much electricity is being used for data centers and data transmission. I've seen figures that are anywhere from 2.5% to 4% of total electricity demand worldwide, which is a pretty big number. It's like the load of 50 Calgarys around the clock, which is powering the data complex, which, that didn't really exist 15 years ago.
Yeah.
It's still growing. To the extent it's growing, I don't know, but it's going higher.
Well, if you look at the management discussions around the companies that build server farm facilities, because a lot of this stuff is contracted out. I mean, they are growing like compounding. I don't know, it's like 20% or something. It's just ridiculous how fast they're growing.
They're going fast, yeah.
And so this tells me that the demand is going up. I mean, the chip makers are going through the roof in terms of their stock prices, and the expectation that this is going to create even more data computing power. It just makes sense.
Yep.
Right? And I mean, I think you did some numbers in terms of how much electricity is being, well, you just said 2 to 3%, but it's actually 5 or 6 times the amount that is currently being used to charge up electric vehicles.
Yep.
That's another way of thinking about it.
Hey, I asked ChatGPT if I should be concerned by the amount of electricity needed
did you? Okay,
because of
well.
these. And actually, it said that, they're continually improving and getting more efficient, and that over time, you're going to be able to do more with less electricity, just like everything else, right? So
it's interesting that it would bias towards itself like that.
It didn't see a problem.
No.
But
this is to me like a lot more base load demand, because these server farms are just whizzing away answering people's questions and controlling things.
Well, there's probably a pattern to it, though. Like during the workday, it might be higher. In the evening, it's less, you'd think.
But there's time zone shifts around the world.
Globally. That's true. The server farm could be anywhere in the world. I did one example. Like if you just Google search something, but then you ask the exact same thing to the chat, it takes quite a bit longer to come back, which just makes me think there's way more computational. Yeah, on the chat. More computational energy being used to come up with the same answer.
Wouldn't doubt it. Yeah, makes sense.
So
okay.
I think we should wrap up.
This has been an amazing conversation. We can talk a lot more because it intersects with commerce and philosophy. And I love talking about all that stuff. And I know you do too, Cory. Thanks so much for your time, for coming in. We should let you get back to your trading desk and make your bets. Thanks so much for coming in.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. It was a great discussion. And thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate us on the app that you listen to and tell someone else about us.
For more ideas and insights, visit arcenergyinstitute.com.